Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to do a short flight in Southern California to look at some of the navigation tools that we can use to accomplish a mission in career mode faster, safer, and more efficiently than just accepting the route that it provides you by default. A lot of the things that we'll look at will also help you become less dependent on the visual assistance display, which, let's be honest, is kind of like cheating anyways, and not to mention that it completely breaks immersion too. Our first two tips are actually things that we can do before we get going, and our first one is something you can do before you even accept the mission. The airports in career mode can often be a little bit dicey to get into, so one easy way to make sure that it's not sending you somewhere that you don't feel comfortable landing is as soon as you've gone into the mission briefing, you can bring up the EFB to check it out in way more detail. The route should already be loaded up when you click into the mission like this, and if you go to the map page of the planner, we can zoom in on our destination airport, and if it's not already, you'll want to switch it into satellite mode with the filters on the bottom right. Like this, we can actually check out what the airport looks like from the air, and it'll give you a good idea of the surrounding area, as well as if there are any trees or buildings around that could make for an impossible or extremely difficult landing. Next, before you get going, it's often worth having a look at the flight plan that got loaded up for you, because at times it can be more complex than it needs to be, and tweaking it either before or during your flight can save you some flight time either for VFR or IFR flights. For example, if we look at this route that it's suggested for a short delivery flight, we're taking off and going northeast for a fair bit first before turning southbound towards our destination. But if you look closely, there's a way that you can do this way faster than this. What we're going to do instead is we'll look at how to change the route to go southeast right after takeoff, and to get around the mountain that's in the way of us going directly there, we'll go through the valley that's right here until we can make a beeline towards the airport. For a VFR flight, you could do this entirely visually, of course, but to help us out, what we'll do is bring the level of detail up a notch, and what we'll do is look for a waypoint that we can use that can send us in the right direction. All the blue spots that you see on the map are nav aids that we can add to our route, and there are a few of them near the valley that we want to go through, like Warwick or Sunset. What we'll do now then is we'll change our flight plan first by removing our existing waypoint that we don't want anymore, and then we'll add Sunset to our route, and then from there we'll have a look and see what it gives us, and we'll add another waypoint if we think we need it. To do that, we have to start by bringing up the flight plan, and then to remove our existing waypoint, we'll bring up the cursor by pressing the top of the FMS dial, and if our waypoint wasn't already highlighted like it is now, we could just scroll down to it using the big FMS dial. Once our waypoint's highlighted, we can press the clear key to remove it, and that's just going to bring up a little pop-up asking us to confirm that's definitely what we want to do, and we can just press enter on that one. We still need to add in our new waypoint to fully update our route though. So what I'll do is I'll scroll down to the empty entry in the en route section. And from here, I'll bring up the waypoint entry page by turning the inner or the small FMS dial. If you have a keyboard connected, the easiest way to enter the waypoint is to press the little keyboard entry icon that's right here to type it in. However, if you don't, you can just use the big and small FMS dials to scroll through each letter one at a time. It'll just take a little bit longer to do that way. Once you've got your waypoint typed in, you can press enter, and that'll add our waypoint to the route directly. So now if we were to close out our flight plan, you can see it's definitely a much more direct flight now. The cool thing about how we set up this route is that we don't even have to go all the way out to the Sunset waypoint, since it would take us out further than we actually need. Once we're through the valley and we're clear of the mountain to our left, we can go direct to the airport at that point. So if we were to go back to the multifunction display now, and we go into our flight plan, we'll be able to update our route again to take that little shortcut. You can see we've actually got another 8 miles before sunset, but it's only 5 to the airport. So to go directly there instead, we can bring the cursor up again, and we'll want to scroll down to our destination airport. Then from here, we can press the direct to button, which will open up a little context window for us to confirm our choice. We can press enter twice here to activate our direct to the airport, and that'll update our flight plan immediately. And if you're flying in nav mode, the plane will automatically start to turn to go directly to what you told it to. Again, just cutting us out a little bit of flight time. Now that we're on our way to the airport, the next thing that we need to figure out is when to start our descent. And although we could use VNav for this, it's honestly just easier to calculate it using some rough math and the 3-to-1 rule, which works in almost all situations and even with airliners. The way it works is pretty simple. You take the thousands of feet that you have to lose and multiply that by 3 to figure out how far we should be from our destination before starting our descent. We're at 5,500 feet right now, and our airport is at 2,800 feet. So we have about 3,000 feet to lose. And if we multiply that by 3, it's going to give us a top of descent of 9 miles from the airport. We can check our distance to the airport either on the flight plan page, which we looked at previously, or even easier, if your next waypoint is the airport, you can also just look above the FMA on the primary flight display, and it'll be written right there for you. Now, how fast we should make that descent is going to depend on our ground speed, and the way to approximate it is to divide the ground speed by 2 and then add a 0 to it, which will give us a rough estimate of the feet per minute that we should use. Our ground speed is shown right here on the multifunction display, and I know it's a little bit small, but it's 90 knots. And if we do our quick math like we just said, that gives us a descent rate of about 450 to 500 feet per minute. That's given us everything that we need to descend on time, but there are some situations where you can't plan a normal descent and you end up a little bit high as you arrive at the airport. There's an easy fix for that too, which the G1000 supports natively, and that's to add a hold point, which would normally be done at a waypoint before arriving at the airfield, but in Flight Sim, no one's going to yell at you if you do it right over the airport as well. What you'll want to do is head back to the flight plan page and bring up the cursor again to highlight the waypoint that you want to add the hold point around, which in our case happens to be the airport. Then from there, we can press the menu button, which will bring up a little context menu, and we can scroll down to the hold at waypoint option. And when we press enter on that, it's going to bring up a menu where we can customize our hold pattern. You can change a bunch of details about the hold from here, but we're just going to leave everything as is and scroll down to the load option. And then from there, we can press enter to load that hold into our flight plan. Then from there, so long as we're in nav mode on the autopilot, it'll automatically go into the hold for us once it reaches our waypoint. And that gives us all of the time that we need to start or even continue our descent before setting up for the approach, since we can stay in the hold as long as we need. Once we've reached our pattern altitude, we could just disable the autopilot and hand fly the approach, but there are some situations where keeping the runway in sight is pretty difficult because of the terrain, especially for grass fields, which are just so hard to spot. Guess what though, there's actually another feature in the G1000 that we can use for that, and it'll work at any airfield no matter the size, and what it'll do is give us an extended runway centerline that we can use as a guide to line ourselves up on final. Let's head back into our flight plan one last time for that then, and the button we're looking for this time is the procedure button, and then we'll go into the select approach menu, which is the first one that it's selected by default. Depending on the airport, there may be some instrument procedures listed here as well, but you'll want to scroll down to the visual approach for the runway that you're going to be landing on, which for us is going to be 08 left. Once you select your runway, it's going to ask you whether you want to use the vectors or the straight-in approach, and you can really pick either one in this scenario, but the straight-in approach will give you an even longer final approach path. After we've made our choice, we can scroll down to the activate option, and once we press enter here, it'll update our flight plan immediately, and we can see our extended runway centerline is now showing just to the north of us now. What I usually do before activating an approach like this is I'll use heading mode on the autopilot to put myself effectively on a downwind leg, so flying parallel but in the opposite direction of the runway that I want to land on. Doing this with heading mode means that the plane won't automatically start to turn towards our approach path once we activate the approach, and it gives me the option to decide how long I want to fly outbound for before turning back towards the runway. The really neat thing about using the visual approach procedure though is it also gives you glide path information, which you can use to help decide when you're far enough out from the runway to get turned around and start a stable descent. If you're familiar with how to fly an ILS, it's going to feel very similar to you because it shows you the glide path information in the exact same way in the primary flight display. Right now, our ideal glide path diamond is just a little bit below the middle of the indicator, meaning that we're above the glide path that it's calculated, so it's probably best to wait just a little bit more until it's at least reached the middle here before making our base turn. There are exceptions to that, of course, if you're flying in a tight space and you're going to have to do a steep descent, or there are obstacles that you need to get around, but in general, this should still work pretty well for you. Once we're ready to turn back towards the runway, we can look either at the map or the HSI to make our base and final turns, since we can easily see what headings are going to put us perpendicular to and then on the final approach course, since the arrow of the HSI will point at the runway heading. Not only that, but we also have our extended runway centerline that we can refer back to on the multifunction display, so it makes it really easy to know where you are and when you're coming up on the final approach course to time our turn just perfectly. What I've done here is I've actually turned about 45 degrees off the final approach course because it'll make it easier to fly inbound towards the runway, as well as to try and spot it again if I lost it in the distance. At this point though, I'm looking for the runway, and I'm also keeping an eye on the magenta line as it moves more towards our plane, because once it's right over us in the middle of the HSI, we'll be perfectly lined up with the final approach course. While we're doing this, we have to also descend at the same time, and we can use the glide path as a guide, but it's important to remember that although it looks like a glide slope of an ILS, it definitely is not. That means there could be a mountain or something else in the way of us getting down to the runway, so you still have to be looking out of the window for anything that could get in the way. When the path's all clear like today though, you can definitely use it as a guide, and what you'll want to do is keep the diamond at the center of the glide path indicator. If the diamond starts to move higher up, you need to shallow up your descent rate because you're getting below the ideal glide path. And if it starts to go below the middle instead, then you need to increase your descent rate to catch it. And like we were saying earlier, we can also use the HSI to time our turn if we still don't have a visual on the runway for whatever reason, because when the course needle is centered on top of our airplane like it is now, we are perfectly lined up with the runway centerline. The bottom line is that the visual approach is really there as an aid to help you find the runway, but you still have to do the work of spotting it, deciding if it's safe enough to proceed, and fly the approach by looking out of the front and not only relying on your instruments. With all of the tips we looked at though, you should have all that you need to make your next flight a little bit easier, so make sure to like the video on your way out and subscribe as well to get more videos like this one.